Mafia boss saw his maid's daughter cleaning at 2 a.m. The truth about her bruises broke him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. The night was still, but there was something unsettling about the quiet that filled the grand mansion. The clock on the wall showed it was nearly 2 in the morning. Most of the house was dark, with only the faint glow of security lights illuminating the halls. In the distance, the soft sound of a broom brushing against the floor echoed through the corridors. It was odd. The mansion's grand rooms, normally filled with bustling staff during the day, were now empty, silent. Yet there was one person still awake, working tirelessly at this late hour. And that person was Maria, the daughter of the maid who worked for the family. She was a quiet girl, hardly ever seen by the family. The Mafia boss, a powerful and ruthless man who had built his empire with an iron fist, had never paid much attention to her. He was always too busy with his affairs, his mind occupied with bigger, more dangerous matters. But tonight, as he returned from a late meeting, something about the scene caught his attention. The sound of the broom, the faint creak of the floorboards. He paused, his sharp eyes scanning the hallway. There she was, Maria. She was cleaning, scrubbing the floors as though the hour of the night was no different from any other. He watched her for a moment, puzzled. Why was she still up? And why was she doing this alone, in the middle of the night? It was strange. His gaze lingered on her, and then something else caught his attention. Her arms. Her bare arms, exposed in the dim light. The bruises. Dark, ugly marks scattered across her skin, as though someone had been rough with her. The Mafia boss's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any young maid. This was someone in pain. Someone who had been hurt. The sight of those bruises stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger, nor was it sympathy. It was confusion, a deep, unsettling feeling that gnawed at him. Who had done this to her? Why was she suffering like this? He didn't know her well, but he knew enough. Her mother, a quiet, hard-working woman, was always polite but distant, a shadow in the background of the household. And Maria? Maria had always been the same, silent, withdrawn, and never a burden. But tonight, her silence spoke volumes. The Mafia boss took a slow step forward, his shadow falling across her. She stiffened but didn't look up. He cleared his throat, his voice low, but commanding. Maria, he said, his voice echoing in the hallway. She flinched slightly, but still didn't meet his gaze. What are you doing up so late? She finally lifted her eyes to him, but only for a moment, as if the weight of her secrets was too much to bear. She didn't answer immediately, and that only made him more curious. I asked you a question, he pressed, his tone softer now, though still firm. She hesitated, then replied in a barely audible voice. I had to clean, sir. The floors, they need to be cleaned. He frowned. At this hour? Why not wait until the morning? She shook her head slightly, her eyes lowering to the floor again. There's no time. It has to be done now. Something didn't sit right with him. The Mafia boss stood there for a moment, studying her. There was more to this than just cleaning. But what? And why was she hiding the truth behind those bruises? His mind raced with questions, but he held his silence. This wasn't just about cleaning floors anymore. Something deeper was going on, something he needed to uncover. As he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the image of her, her bruised arms, and the haunting sense that this was only the beginning of a story he was not yet ready to understand. The Mafia boss couldn't get the image of Maria out of his mind. Her bruises, her silence, the way she avoided his gaze when he confronted her. It had all left an unsettling feeling deep inside him. He had seen violence before, but never in this context. He had been a part of that world, where strength and power ruled, where fear kept people in line. But this felt different. The following day, as the sun set behind the mansion's high walls, the Mafia boss found himself pacing in his office, his thoughts consumed by the girl. He had never been one to concern himself with the lives of his staff. They were tools, nothing more. But Maria was different. He couldn't explain why, but there was something about her that pulled at him. It wasn't just the bruises. It wasn't just the oddity of her cleaning at 2 in the morning. There was something deeper, something that he had yet to uncover. He needed answers, and he wasn't one to wait for things to come to him. He had the power to get what he wanted, and right now, what he wanted was the truth. That night, he decided to pay her a visit again. As he walked through the quiet hallways of the mansion, the sound of his footsteps echoed off the marble floors. His mind was focused, calculating. He needed to find out who was hurting her. What kind of life was she leading behind those bruises? He stopped outside the maid's quarters and knocked firmly on the door. There was no answer at first. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. His patience was wearing thin. He wasn't used to being ignored. But then, he heard a soft shuffling inside. The door creaked open just a crack, revealing Maria standing there, her eyes wide with surprise. She looked vulnerable, her small frame framed by the dim light from inside the room. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she quickly hid them behind her back. "Maria," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We need to talk." She hesitated, then slowly opened the door wider, stepping aside to let him in. The room was small, sparsely furnished with just a bed and a dresser. The air was thick with the smell of cleaning supplies. It was clear she had been working nonstop, but there was no sign of her mother. The Mafia boss's eyes briefly scanned the room, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. "Sit down," he ordered, his voice softer now. Maria complied, nervously perching herself on the edge of the bed. The Mafia boss leaned against the doorframe, studying her closely. "Tell me the truth," he said. "What happened to you? Who did this to you?" Maria's eyes flickered with fear, and for a moment, she looked as though she might collapse under the weight of the question. Her lips trembled, and she fought to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. She didn't want to say it. She didn't want to admit the horror she had been living with. But the Mafia boss's gaze was unrelenting. She knew he wouldn't let it go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke in a whisper, her voice barely audible. "It's my father." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. He hurts me. He hurts my mother, too." The Mafia boss's expression darkened, and his jaw tightened. This was something he hadn't expected. A man in his position knew how to deal with threats, how to deal with enemies. But a situation like this was personal. "Where is he now?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, but there was a dangerous edge to it. Maria shook her head, tears now streaming down her face. "He's gone. He left a few weeks ago, but I don't know where he is. He's always been unpredictable." The Mafia boss stood silently for a moment, processing what he had just heard. His mind raced, calculating the next steps. He had built his empire on power and control, but this was something different. It was a situation that hit too close to home. The idea that someone could hurt an innocent girl like Maria, someone who had done nothing to deserve it, sparked something deep within him. He couldn't allow this. No one, no matter who they were, would ever lay a hand on someone under his roof. He knew he needed to act, and he needed to act fast. But as he looked at Maria, sitting there, trembling and broken, a sense of guilt gnawed at him. How had he missed this? How had he ignored the signs? The girl had been living in pain for who knows how long, and he hadn't noticed until it was almost too late. "You're safe here," he finally said, his voice firm with determination. "No one will hurt you again. I'll make sure of it." Maria looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "Thank you," she whispered, but the words sounded almost too weak to carry the weight of her gratitude. The Mafia boss turned and walked toward the door, his mind already working on the next steps. He had a lot to do, and the first thing was to make sure Maria never had to face this kind of pain again. But as he closed the door behind him, something inside him told him that this wasn't going to be an easy road. There were deeper forces at play here, forces he hadn't yet fully understood, and he would need to tread carefully if he wanted to protect her. The following days passed in a blur for the Mafia boss. His mind kept returning to Maria, her tear-streaked face, and the haunting revelation about her father. He had dealt with criminals, corrupt businessmen, and dangerous enemies before, but this was different. This wasn't just about power, control, or vengeance. This was about protecting an innocent life. He spent hours in his office, talking to his most trusted men, trying to find out as much as possible about Maria's father. His men had eyes everywhere, and soon enough, they found out that he had been a low-level criminal, someone who had been involved in petty thefts, gambling, and occasional violence. But there was more. He had a history of abuse, both with Maria and her mother. His name was Dominic, and he was known for his unpredictability. He would disappear for days, sometimes weeks, only to return and cause chaos. The Mafia boss didn't like unpredictability, especially when it came to matters that affected the people under his roof. He needed to find Dominic and deal with him, but he also knew that Maria was fragile. He couldn't risk her being caught up in this. He had already seen the damage that her father had done to her. No more. He would protect her at all costs. Later that evening, he called Maria into his office. She entered hesitantly, her eyes downcast, still avoiding his gaze. "Maria," he said gently, his voice soft but firm, "I need you to tell me everything. Where is your father now? Do you know where he went after he left?" Maria hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw the full depth of her fear. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice shaky. "He always leaves without warning. I never know where he goes, or when he'll be back. Sometimes he doesn't even come home for weeks." The Mafia boss felt a wave of frustration. He had always prided himself on knowing everything about everyone. But Maria's father, he was a ghost, slipping through the cracks, leaving destruction in his wake. He stood up, walking over to his desk, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface. "If he comes back," he said, his voice growing colder, "I want you to come to me immediately. Don't try to handle this on your own. Do you understand?" Maria nodded, her eyes still lowered, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, something he hadn't seen before. It was hope. He knew it wasn't much, but it was something. "I understand," she said quietly. The Mafia boss watched her leave, his mind racing. He couldn't help but feel that time was running out. He had to find Dominic, and he had to find him fast. But more than that, he had to protect Maria. He wasn't sure how he was going to do it yet, but he knew one thing for sure: no one would hurt her again. Over the next few days, the Mafia boss began to make his moves. His men were on high alert, watching for any sign of Dominic's return. Meanwhile, the Mafia boss kept a close eye on Maria. He noticed the way she flinched when someone raised their voice, the way she kept to herself, always avoiding any interaction that might draw attention to her. It broke his heart to see her like this, but he couldn't show it. He had to remain focused. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. But it was hard. Every time he saw her, he felt a deep sense of responsibility for her well-being. She was under his protection now, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, word came that Dominic had been spotted. He had returned to the city, and his whereabouts were now known. The Mafia boss didn't waste a second. He gathered his men, preparing for what was to come. He knew Dominic wouldn't go down without a fight. But the Mafia boss wasn't afraid. He had dealt with worse. What troubled him more was what would happen after. What would happen to Maria when her father was gone? Would she finally be free of the nightmare that had haunted her for so long? Or would the scars from her past continue to haunt her, even in her newfound safety? The Mafia boss didn't have the answers, but he was determined to find out. His men moved swiftly, tracking Dominic to a rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city. The Mafia boss didn't hesitate. He led his team through the back entrance, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the decrepit building's walls. They reached the door to Dominic's apartment and kicked it open. Inside, they found Dominic, surrounded by bottles of liquor and the remnants of his latest binge. He barely had time to react before the Mafia boss's men subdued him, pinning him to the ground. The Mafia boss approached slowly, his eyes cold, calculating. "You've hurt the wrong people, Dominic," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Dominic sneered, but there was a tremor in his voice. "What are you going to do? Kill me? I've been in worse situations than this." The Mafia boss crouched down, his face inches from Dominic's. "No, I'm not going to kill you. I'm going to make sure you never hurt anyone again." With that, he nodded to his men. They would handle the rest. As the Mafia boss walked away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Dominic was out of the picture. Maria would be safe now. But the question still lingered in his mind. Was safety enough for her? Would she ever be able to heal from the pain he had caused her? The days that followed Dominic's capture were quiet, but the silence weighed heavily on the Mafia boss. He had done what he needed to do. He had taken care of the threat, ensured Maria's safety, but something still gnawed at him. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl, the way her bruises haunted him, the way her silence, though not unspoken, spoke volumes. The tension that lingered between them was palpable, and the boss knew that even with Dominic gone, there was still a long road ahead for Maria. He had kept his distance from her after that night in his office, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more. It was more than just protecting her physically. It was about fixing the broken pieces of her life, a life that had been torn apart by the very man who should have protected her. But where did he even begin? The Mafia boss didn't know. He wasn't a counselor. He wasn't a father. He was a man who had spent most of his life using fear as a tool to control others. He had no idea how to repair the damage that had been done to Maria's spirit. As the sun set over the mansion, he found himself pacing again, the weight of his thoughts pressing on him. He knew he couldn't keep her locked away in this bubble of protection forever. She needed to live her life, to have some kind of future beyond the walls of this mansion. And yet, every time he thought about letting her go, the memory of her bruises held him back. He needed to know she was truly safe. But how could he ensure that without trapping her in a gilded cage? That night, as he walked through the mansion, he heard the soft sound of a door creaking open. He froze. It was Maria. She was standing by the balcony, her back to him, gazing out into the night. There was something so fragile about her silhouette in the moonlight, a stillness that seemed to match the weight in his chest. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. Should he speak to her? Should he give her space? He decided to approach slowly, making his footsteps light so as not to startle her. As he reached her side, she didn't turn to look at him, but he could feel the tension in the air, thick with unsaid words. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Maria stiffened, but didn't move away. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "I'm fine," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The Mafia boss studied her for a moment. There was something in her tone that didn't quite match her words. "Maria, you don't have to hide anything from me. You've been through more than anyone should have to. But you don't have to carry it alone." She finally turned to face him, her eyes distant and guarded. "I'm not hiding anything," she replied, but her voice faltered. "It's just, I don't know how to live like this. I don't know how to be normal." Her words caught him off guard. He had expected her to be angry, scared, maybe even confused, but not this. "What do you mean?" he asked, his brow furrowing in concern. "You're safe now. Dominic won't hurt you again. You can start over." Maria shook her head slowly. "It's not just about him," she whispered. "It's about everything. I don't know who I am anymore. I've been living in fear for so long that I don't know how to live without it." The Mafia boss's heart clenched. Her words were raw, vulnerable, and for the first time, he saw the full extent of the damage that had been done to her. "I get it," he said quietly. "I know you're scared. But you don't have to be afraid anymore." Maria glanced at him then, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand him. "How do you know that?" she asked. He hesitated, then spoke in a voice tinged with more honesty than he had ever shown. "Because I was once someone who lived in fear too. Fear of losing everything. Fear of being powerless. I understand more than you think." There was a long silence between them. The moonlight seemed to fall heavier on Maria's face as she absorbed his words. The Mafia boss wasn't sure if she believed him, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had finally opened up, even if just a little. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel something other than anger or control. He allowed himself to feel the weight of her pain, and in that moment, he knew that he couldn't just be her protector. He had to be more than that. "Maria," he said, his voice softer now. "I know you're afraid, but I promise you, I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone." Maria didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also something else. Hope. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And that was enough. She stepped closer to him, hesitating for just a second before finally speaking. "Thank you," she said quietly. The Mafia boss nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was thanking her for. But there was something in her voice, something fragile yet resilient, that made him believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better for her. He didn't know how or when, but he was willing to find out. He had always been the man who controlled everything in his world, but Maria was different. She had broken through the walls he had spent a lifetime building, and now, he found himself wanting to protect her, not just from the world, but from herself. He stood there for a long while, watching her. The night was still, the air cool against their skin. There was nothing more to say, not yet. But the moment felt like the beginning of something new, a quiet understanding between them, a chance for both of them to heal. The days after their conversation were quiet, but the tension between the Mafia boss and Maria had shifted. There was an unspoken understanding now, a fragile trust that seemed to grow a little with each passing day. Maria, still cautious but less withdrawn, had started to spend more time outside of her quarters. She wasn't hiding in the shadows as much anymore, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she was starting to feel like a part of the world around her, not just a ghost in the background. The Mafia boss kept his distance, giving her space to breathe, but always watching from the periphery. He never let his guard down fully. She was vulnerable, and he knew it. He couldn't afford to let anything or anyone threaten her again. But despite his need to protect her, there was still something gnawing at him, a question he couldn't shake. What was he supposed to do next? He had already handled the threat of Dominic, but that didn't solve everything. Maria was still healing, still carrying the scars of her past. And while she had started to open up, he could tell that there was still a part of her that remained locked away. He couldn't just pretend that everything was fine. That night, as he sat in his office, the weight of these thoughts pressed down on him. He was used to controlling his empire with precision, but Maria wasn't a business deal. She wasn't just another piece to be moved around the board. She was a person who had suffered. He couldn't just fix her with money or power. He had to find a way to help her rebuild her life, to let her live without fear. The following morning, he called for Maria. He hadn't seen her for a few days, and despite his efforts to give her space, he felt a lingering concern. She had been quiet lately, even more so than usual. The knock at her door was soft, but it was enough to get her attention. When she opened it, the Mafia boss stood there, his eyes calm but serious. "Maria," he began, his voice steady. "I need to talk to you." She blinked, surprised to see him. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter her small room. The space was sparse but neat, just a bed and a small dresser. "What is it, sir?" she asked, her voice cautious but polite. The Mafia boss studied her for a moment before speaking. "I can see that you've been distant lately. I want to make sure you're okay." Maria hesitated, avoiding his gaze. She shrugged, her shoulders tight. "I'm fine," she replied, but her voice lacked the conviction it once had. "No, you're not," the Mafia boss said softly. "I know this is hard for you, but I need you to understand something. You don't have to go through this alone." Her eyes flickered up to meet his, and for the first time in a long while, he saw a flash of something, hope. But it quickly faded. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've always been," she whispered. "I've spent my whole life in fear. I don't know what it's like to feel safe, to feel like I belong." The Mafia boss's heart clenched at her words. He had never known what it was like to live in fear, to feel helpless. He had spent his life building an empire based on strength and dominance. But in that moment, he realized how little he understood about the kind of pain Maria had endured. "You belong here," he said firmly. "You belong in this house, and you deserve to be treated with respect, with care. You deserve to be happy." Maria looked at him, her expression uncertain. "But how?" she asked quietly. "How can I ever be happy after everything that's happened?" The Mafia boss didn't have an immediate answer, and for a moment, he felt the weight of her question. How could he fix what had been broken for so long? How could he help her heal from something so deep? But then, he remembered something. It wasn't about fixing her. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about helping her find a way forward. "It's not about forgetting what's happened," he said slowly. "It's about finding a way to move forward. One step at a time. You don't have to have all the answers right now, Maria. But you do have a future here. A chance to rebuild. And I'm going to help you with that. You don't have to do it alone." For a moment, there was silence between them, thick with the weight of his words. Maria seemed to be processing everything he had said, and the Mafia boss could see that she was torn between skepticism and the flicker of hope he had sparked in her. "But I don't know how to start," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The Mafia boss took a step closer to her, his expression softening. "We start together," he said simply. "You don't have to figure everything out on your own. I'll be here for you, every step of the way." Maria stood still for a moment, then looked up at him, her eyes full of gratitude and confusion all at once. She didn't say anything at first, but then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. It was a small gesture, but to the Mafia boss, it felt like the first real step toward healing. Thank you, she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that he could feel. It wasn't a promise that everything would be perfect from here on out, but it was a beginning. It was a sign that she was willing to trust him, and maybe even, in time, trust herself again. The Mafia boss turned to leave the room, but before he stepped out, he paused. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his voice low and sincere. Maria didn't respond, but he didn't need her to. He knew that she was on her own path now, a path toward healing, toward finding herself again. And he would be there, every step of the way. The days that followed felt different. The atmosphere around the mansion had changed, the air lighter, but still heavy with the unspoken. Maria, for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, began to venture out more often. She spent her mornings in the garden, tending to the flowers, something she had never done before. It was a small step, but for her, it felt like a victory. She had been through so much, and yet, every day now, she was discovering something new about herself. The Mafia boss watched her from a distance, a quiet observer of her progress. He had promised to help her, but in reality, he wasn't sure how much he could do. He had never been the nurturing type, never had the capacity to understand the emotional toll of what she had gone through. Still, he was trying. Every time he saw her smile, however faint, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. She was healing, slowly but surely. But the scars, both physical and emotional, were still there. The deeper wounds weren't so easily healed. Maria didn't talk much about her past. She rarely mentioned her father, Dominic, except when she had to, and even then, it was brief. But there were moments, quiet moments when she seemed distant, her mind clearly wandering back to the life she had left behind. The Mafia boss noticed these moments. He knew that she wasn't as free as she appeared. The past still haunted her. One afternoon, he found her sitting by the fountain in the garden, staring down at the water, her expression lost in thought. He approached cautiously, not wanting to disturb her, but unable to stay away. "Maria," he said softly, standing a few feet away. She looked up at him, surprised, but didn't move. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone gentle. She hesitated, then nodded, though her eyes told a different story. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice lacked the usual conviction. He could tell there was something on her mind, something she wasn't sharing. "Maria," he pressed, "you don't have to pretend with me. If something's bothering you, you can talk about it." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the water for a moment longer, her hands folded in her lap. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared," she admitted, her words simple, yet loaded with emotion. The Mafia boss took a step closer, his expression softening. "Scared of what?" he asked, his voice steady. She glanced at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I'm scared that the past will always be a part of me. That no matter what I do, I'll never be able to escape it." The Mafia boss's heart clenched at her words. He understood that fear all too well. It was a fear he had lived with for years. "Maria, I can't promise you that the past will go away," he said slowly. "But I can promise you that it doesn't have to define you. You have the power to choose who you are now. You don't have to be the person you were before." She shook her head, her eyes filled with doubt. "I don't know how to be anyone else. I've been living in fear for so long. It's hard to imagine life without it." The Mafia boss knelt down beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly. "I'm here, and you don't have to do this alone." Maria met his gaze then, her eyes searching his face for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps strength. "But what if I can't change?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "What if I'm always broken?" The Mafia boss took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. He had built his empire on strength, on power, but he knew that even the strongest people carried their own wounds. He had his own demons, his own scars that no one could see. "You're not broken, Maria," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "You're just not finished yet. And neither am I." She seemed to consider his words, her gaze drifting back to the water, but this time, there was a shift in her expression, a subtle softness. "I don't know how to believe that," she whispered. "I don't know how to believe that I can be more than what I've been." The Mafia boss smiled gently. "It's not about believing in it all at once. It's about taking small steps, one day at a time. And when you fall, I'll be there to help you get back up." For the first time in a long time, Maria's lips curled into a faint smile, though it was brief. She didn't say anything in response, but for the Mafia boss, that smile spoke volumes. It was a sign that, despite everything, there was hope. And that hope, fragile as it was enough. Over the next few weeks, Maria continued to make small but significant changes. She began to attend the occasional social gathering in the mansion, talking with the staff, though she remained quiet, still shy. But there was a quiet confidence in her now, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. And the Mafia boss? He watched her progress, quietly proud, but still uncertain about his own role in her journey. He had promised to protect her, and he would continue to do so. But the road to healing was long, and he knew it was one that Maria would have to walk on her own, step by step. He could guide her, but ultimately, it was up to her to decide who she wanted to become. As he looked at her, growing stronger day by day, he realized that, perhaps, he was learning something, too. Maybe it wasn't just about fixing what was broken. Maybe it was about accepting the cracks and finding the strength to move forward in spite of them. Weeks passed, and the mansion, once filled with a tense, suffocating atmosphere, seemed to have transformed. Maria was changing in subtle but undeniable ways. She no longer spent every moment in the shadows, avoiding interaction. Instead, she walked through the halls with a quiet confidence, her head held a little higher, her steps a little steadier. The Mafia boss watched her closely, always from a distance, but with a growing sense of pride. It was clear that Maria was beginning to reclaim her life, one small step at a time. She still had moments of doubt, times when her old fears crept in, but she was learning to face them, to confront the parts of herself that had been buried for so long. She spent more time with the other staff, helping in the kitchen, chatting with the other maids, and even assisting with the garden. Though she rarely spoke about the past, there was a quiet strength in her actions that spoke volumes. The Mafia boss, too, had begun to notice something in himself shifting. The woman who had once been nothing more than a passing figure in his life was now someone who had begun to matter to him, in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. He hadn't allowed himself to care for anyone in a long time, not like this. He had built his empire on fear, on power, and on control, but with Maria, he found himself unsure of how to act. He was used to making decisions, pulling strings, and seeing things fall into place, but with her, things were different. It was unsettling, this vulnerability, but he couldn't ignore it. And so, he watched from the shadows, never intruding, but always present. One evening, as he walked through the mansion, he found himself standing by the grand staircase, looking down into the courtyard. Maria was sitting there, as she often did now, watching the sunset. Her figure was framed by the fading light, and for a moment, he couldn't help but marvel at the change in her. She had become stronger, more resilient, but there was still a sadness in her eyes that hadn't disappeared. It wasn't something he could fix, he knew that. She had to heal in her own time. But he would be there, ready to support her, whenever she was ready. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should approach her. He had never been good with emotions, with those subtle, delicate moments that required tenderness instead of control. But there was something in her quiet presence that drew him closer, something that made him want to be there, just for a moment, to make sure she wasn't alone. Slowly, he walked down the stairs and across the courtyard, the soft crunch of gravel beneath his shoes the only sound in the otherwise silent air. As he reached her, Maria looked up, her eyes meeting his, a brief flicker of surprise in her gaze. "I didn't hear you coming," she said softly, her voice calm but cautious. "I didn't mean to startle you," the Mafia boss replied, his voice steady, though there was an unfamiliar softness to it. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say, but finally, he spoke. "You've been spending a lot of time out here." Maria nodded, her gaze returning to the fading sky. "I like the quiet," she said quietly. "It helps me think." The Mafia boss didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, watching the sky with her, the two of them sharing a moment of peace in the quiet of the evening. It wasn't much, but it felt significant, like a small step forward in their journey together. After a long silence, Maria spoke again. "I've been thinking about my future," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About what I want, and what I can do with my life now." The Mafia boss turned his attention fully to her, his expression unreadable. "And what is it that you want?" he asked, his tone low and curious. Maria hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her seat, as if searching for the right words. "I want to be free," she said finally. "I want to live without the weight of my past, without always being afraid. I want to make something of myself, not just be the girl who was hurt." The Mafia boss nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "That's a good goal," he said softly. "But it won't be easy. There will be times when the past tries to pull you back. But you don't have to go through it alone." Maria turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. "I know," she said quietly. "And I'm not alone. I have you." The word surprised him, but he didn't show it. Instead, he gave a small nod. "You do. And I'll always be here, if you need me." The sun had almost completely set now, leaving only the fading remnants of light in the sky. The air was cool, and the quiet of the courtyard was a comforting contrast to the rest of the world. They sat there together for a long time, neither of them speaking, but both finding comfort in each other's presence. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the Mafia boss felt a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't know what the future held for either of them, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to control everything. Maria was strong. She was finding her way. And maybe, just maybe, he was learning to let go, to trust in her strength as much as he trusted in his own. The days after their quiet conversation in the garden passed with a noticeable shift in the dynamics between Maria and the Mafia boss. Maria had become more present, more engaged with the life around her. The emotional walls she had built were slowly crumbling, but the process was delicate, like a fragile flower that had just begun to bloom. For the Mafia boss, it was a confusing feeling. For years, he had kept people at a distance, trusted no one, and ruled with an iron fist. But Maria, with her quiet strength and vulnerability, was different. He found himself constantly thinking about her, wondering how he could help her move forward. It wasn't just about protecting her from the outside world anymore. It was about helping her rebuild her life, piece by piece. Yet, he still struggled with how to do that. He wasn't used to being compassionate, wasn't used to offering anything beyond the security of wealth and power. But with Maria, he was learning that sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness could make the biggest difference. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, he found himself walking through the hallways of the mansion, his mind heavy with the weight of his thoughts. He had always been a man of action, decisive, firm, unwavering. But with Maria, every decision seemed to carry more weight. She was making progress, yes, but he couldn't help but wonder if it was enough. He came to a stop outside her room. The door was ajar, and he could hear soft voices from within. He knew the staff had started to take notice of her improvements, the way she interacted with them, the way she smiled more, spoke more. It was all part of her recovery, he realized. But it was more than just recovery. She was beginning to find herself again. Stepping inside, he saw her sitting by the window, looking out at the garden. The light from the setting sun bathed her in a warm, golden glow, and for a brief moment, she looked peaceful. It was a rare sight, one that made the Mafia boss pause. She didn't hear him enter, but he could tell she was aware of his presence. After a moment, she turned to face him. "I didn't hear you," she said, a hint of a smile on her lips. He gave her a small smile in return, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said, his voice gentle. "I wanted to see how you were doing." Maria met his gaze, her eyes soft but guarded. "I'm doing better," she replied quietly. "I think I'm starting to feel like myself again." The Mafia boss felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words, but there was a lingering doubt in his mind. She had come a long way, but the scars of her past weren't easily erased. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "You deserve to feel like yourself again, Maria. You deserve peace." She nodded slowly, looking out the window again. "But sometimes, I wonder if I can ever truly have peace. What if the past never lets go?" The question hit the Mafia boss harder than he expected. He had spent most of his life fighting battles, both physical and emotional. But peace had always been something he sought, but never fully understood. "You're right," he said softly, walking a little closer to her. "The past has a way of following us. But that doesn't mean it has to control us." Maria turned to face him again, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to understand him better. "How do you do it?" she asked, her voice small but curious. How do you let go of the past? The Mafia boss exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had never truly let go of the past. It had shaped him, molded him into the man he was today. But perhaps that wasn't the answer she needed to hear. I don't know, he admitted. I've spent so many years focused on power and control that I never stopped to think about letting go. But I think it's not about forgetting the past. It's about accepting it. About finding a way to move forward, even with all the pain. Maria was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. He could see the wheels turning in her head. I think that's what I'm trying to do, she said finally, her voice filled with a quiet determination. I'm trying to accept what happened, but not let it define me. The Mafia boss nodded, feeling a sense of pride swell in his chest. She was stronger than she realized. You're already doing it, he said. Every day, you're moving forward. And I'm proud of you. Maria looked down at her hands, her fingers gently playing with the fabric of her sleeve. I don't feel strong, she said softly. I still feel so broken, like I'm not the person I was before. The Mafia boss reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly tender. Maria, you don't have to be the person you were before, he said. You're becoming someone new, someone who is stronger, wiser, and more capable than you ever knew. And I'm here to help you, no matter what. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. Thank you, she whispered. It was a simple expression, but it meant everything. The Mafia boss gave her a small smile, feeling a strange sense of contentment. He wasn't sure where their journey would take them, but he knew one thing for certain. He would be there every step of the way. As the sun set and the evening grew darker, the two of them sat in silence, the weight of the past slowly lifting, replaced by the promise of a new beginning. It wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but for the first time, the Mafia boss felt that Maria might just have the strength to face them. And he, too, was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could let go of his own past, piece by piece. The weeks continued to pass, and the atmosphere in the mansion grew quieter, but there was still a sense of something unspoken between Maria and the Mafia boss. He had come to accept that things between them were different now, not just as protector and the one being protected, but as two people who shared something deeper. Maria had begun to carve out a life for herself in the mansion, finding moments of joy in simple things like tending to the garden or assisting the staff with their daily tasks. She wasn't the girl who had once flinched at every loud sound or cringed at every harsh word. No, now she was stronger, more resilient. Still, the past lingered in her eyes, in the quiet moments when she thought no one was watching. It wasn't gone, but she was learning how to live with it. And for the Mafia boss, there was still a lingering sense of protectiveness when it came to her. He wasn't sure why. He had helped people before, employees, associates. But with Maria, it was different. The feeling was harder to define. There were moments when he caught himself thinking about her, wondering how she was really doing, what was going on inside her head. He had never been good with emotions, with personal connections. But with her, it felt like something was slowly breaking through the walls he had spent so long building around himself. One evening, as the soft glow of the setting sun filtered through the large windows of the mansion, the Mafia boss found himself walking the long halls, his mind lost in thought. He had always been a man of action, one who made decisions quickly and decisively. But with Maria, he was unsure, uncertain of how to proceed, of what role he should play in her life now that she was beginning to heal. He walked past the study, but something made him pause. He heard soft music, the familiar sound of a piano drifting through the door. Curious, he stepped closer, and as he peered inside, he saw Maria sitting at the grand piano. Her fingers moved with surprising grace across the keys, the melody soft and haunting. He hadn't known she could play, but in that moment, as he stood in the doorway, watching her, he realized there was so much about her he still didn't understand. Maria had always been an enigma to him, someone who was both strong and fragile at once. She had a depth that was far beyond the walls she had built around herself. For a moment, the Mafia boss just stood there, listening, his eyes fixed on her as she played. She wasn't looking at the keys, her eyes closed, lost in the music, the expression on her face serene. It was a side of her he had never seen before. It was as if the piano was the one place where she could truly express herself, where the weight of her past didn't have the power to control her. When the song ended, Maria took a deep breath, her fingers lingering on the final note. She opened her eyes and looked up, her gaze meeting his. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but it quickly faded. "I didn't know you could play," the Mafia boss said, his voice softer than usual. Maria smiled faintly, her gaze dropping to the piano keys. "It's something I've done for a long time," she said quietly. "It helps me clear my head." The Mafia boss took a step forward, his expression thoughtful. "It's beautiful," he said, genuinely impressed. "You have a gift." Maria's smile widened just a little, though it was still tentative. "It's the one thing I've always had for myself. My mother didn't understand it, and my father, well, he never cared." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her past. The Mafia boss didn't respond immediately. He could sense the pain behind her words, the bitterness that lingered when she spoke of her father. He understood that pain all too well, the way the past could shape your present. "Do you still play often?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Maria shook her head slowly. "I used to play every day, but I stopped for a while. It didn't feel right, you know? Like I wasn't allowed to have something just for me." The Mafia boss felt a pang of sympathy for her. He had always been able to take what he wanted, to claim power and control, but Maria had lived a life where even the smallest joys had been taken from her. "You deserve to have things for yourself," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "Don't ever forget that." Maria met his gaze then, her eyes searching his face. "I'm starting to remember that," she said softly. "I'm starting to realize that I can have a future, that I don't have to be defined by what happened to me." The Mafia boss nodded, feeling a strange warmth spread through him. He didn't know what the future held for either of them, but in that moment, it didn't seem as important. What mattered was that Maria was beginning to see herself in a new light. She wasn't the girl she used to be, the one hiding in the shadows. No, she was becoming someone new, someone who could stand on her own. And for the first time in a long time, the Mafia boss realized that he wasn't just protecting her. He was learning from her, too. He was learning what it meant to live without the constant weight of fear, to let go of the need for control and just be. As the evening turned to night and the music faded, the Mafia boss stayed with her, neither of them speaking, but both feeling a sense of peace. There were still many challenges ahead, but for now, they had each other. And that, for both of them, was enough. Weeks passed, and Maria continued to grow stronger each day, her spirit slowly coming back to life. The Mafia boss watched her from the shadows, his feelings for her growing more complicated. He had never expected to care about someone like this. In the world he came from, emotions were a weakness, and weakness meant vulnerability. But with Maria, everything was different. She had broken through the walls he had carefully constructed over the years, and now, he was faced with feelings he wasn't sure how to handle. He had always been a man of control, of power, but Maria was teaching him that maybe there was more to life than that. Maybe there was room for something softer. She had become more than just someone he was protecting. She had become someone he genuinely cared for, someone he felt responsible for in ways that went beyond mere duty. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the mansion, the Mafia boss found himself walking toward the garden. He had been busy with the business side of his empire all day, but tonight, he felt a pull, a need to check in on Maria. She had been spending a lot of time outside lately, her presence grounding the vast, empty spaces of the mansion. He found her sitting by the fountain again, just as he had seen her weeks before, but this time, she wasn't playing the piano. She was simply sitting in the quiet, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes gazing into the water. The Mafia boss hesitated for a moment, watching her from a distance. There was something so serene about the way she looked, like she was finally starting to find peace. He approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her, but also knowing he needed to speak with her. "Maria," he said, his voice soft but carrying across the still air. She looked up at him, surprised, but her face quickly softened into a smile. "I didn't expect you," she said, her voice gentle. "I was just thinking." The Mafia boss nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, settling beside her on the stone bench. Maria hesitated, her eyes still fixed on the water. "I've been thinking about the future," she said finally. "About what comes next." The Mafia boss's curiosity was piqued, but he didn't push. He had learned over the weeks that Maria wasn't one to open up easily. But when she did, her words were always filled with depth, with a kind of wisdom that belied her years. "What does your future look like?" he asked, his tone calm. Maria took a deep breath, her gaze drifting to the sky as if seeking answers there. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I want to help people. I don't want to just be a victim of what happened to me. I want to make a difference, even if it's just in small ways." The Mafia boss listened, feeling a strange tug in his chest. He had spent his life making a name for himself in the criminal world, using fear and intimidation as his tools. But Maria's words, her quiet determination, made him realize that there was another kind of power, a power that came from compassion, from making a difference in someone else's life. "You will make a difference, Maria," he said softly. "You already are." Maria turned to him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to understand the weight of his words. "You really think so?" she asked. The Mafia boss nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, you've come so far, and you'll keep going. I know you will." Maria smiled, a small but genuine smile that made the Mafia boss's heart ache in a way he couldn't explain. He had seen her go through so much, seen the weight of her past bear down on her. But now, in this moment, he could see the light inside her. It wasn't all gone, not yet, but it was beginning to shine through the cracks. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "For everything." The Mafia boss gave a small nod, his throat tight. He had never been good at showing emotion, but with Maria, he found himself unable to hold back. He had spent so many years running from his own feelings, but now, with her, it felt like he didn't need to anymore. He didn't have to control everything. For the first time, he was allowing himself to simply be there, to be present. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice low. "You're not alone. I'll always be here for you." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy with meaning. Maria didn't respond right away, but her eyes softened as she looked at him. For a moment, there was silence between them, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with the unspoken understanding they had built over time. The Mafia boss didn't know what the future held for either of them, but in that moment, he knew that they would face it together. Whatever came next, they would face it as allies, as people who had found something in each other that neither had expected: trust, understanding, and maybe, in time, something more. As the night settled around them, the Mafia boss felt a quiet peace that he hadn't known in years. He had spent so much of his life building an empire, focusing on control and dominance, but now, he understood that there were other things that mattered just as much. Things that couldn't be controlled, but could still change everything. Maria had shown him that. She had taught him that sometimes, letting go was the only way to truly gain something worth keeping. The weeks that followed seemed to pass in a blur, but for Maria, they felt like a new chapter. She had grown so much since her first days at the mansion, and now, she was beginning to see herself differently. The past was still there, lurking in the background, but it no longer held the same power over her. The Mafia boss, though silent in his observations, could see the change in her. The girl who had once cowered in fear, the girl who had hidden away from the world, was now standing tall, finding her place in a life she had never imagined for herself. But with her growth came new challenges. Maria still carried the weight of her past, still grappled with moments of doubt, moments when the memories would rush in, threatening to break through the fragile peace she had built. The Mafia boss noticed these moments, the way her eyes would cloud over, the way she would withdraw into herself. But instead of being the man who fixed everything with his power, he now understood that what she needed most was space and time to heal. He had promised her safety, but there were times when he felt helpless. He had never dealt with emotions like hers, had never faced the kind of healing that couldn't be done with a command or an order. It was a process, slow and uncertain. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and purple, the Mafia boss found himself once again walking through the mansion. His thoughts were preoccupied, as they often were, with business matters, with the empire he had built. But something tugged at him, a need to see how Maria was doing. He knew she was outside, as she often was, either in the garden or by the fountain. He made his way toward the back of the house and found her sitting by the fountain, her gaze fixed on the water. It was a serene sight, one that made him pause. She looked peaceful, yet there was something in the way she held herself that suggested she was carrying something more. He approached her quietly, and when she saw him, she offered a faint smile. "You're out here late," he said, his voice soft. Maria looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. "I like the quiet," she said simply. "It helps me think." He nodded, taking a seat beside her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice low and curious. Maria hesitated before speaking, her fingers playing with the edge of her dress. "I've been thinking about my future," she said quietly. "About what I want to do, and how to make something of myself." The Mafia boss watched her, his expression unreadable, but inside, a flicker of pride sparked. Maria had always been so uncertain of her place in the world, so uncertain of her worth. It was clear now that she was beginning to find that place, that sense of purpose. "And what does your future look like?" he asked. She was silent for a long time, her eyes still focused on the water. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just know I don't want to be the girl I was. I don't want to be someone who hides, who is afraid all the time. I want to be stronger than that." The Mafia boss felt a pang in his chest at her words. He had always admired strength. He had built his entire empire on it. But strength wasn't always about power or dominance. Sometimes, it was about overcoming fear, about facing the darkness and choosing to walk forward anyway. "You are stronger than you know," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. Maria looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "I don't feel strong," she said, the doubt creeping back into her voice. "I still feel like I'm broken." The Mafia boss turned to her, his eyes softening. "You're not broken, Maria," he said gently. "You're just finding your way. Healing isn't a straight line. It's messy, it's complicated. But every step you take is a step forward." Maria didn't respond right away. She seemed to be processing his words, her mind clearly working through something deeper. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "I've been thinking about how much I've changed since I got here," she said. "I've been learning to trust myself again, to believe that maybe I deserve something better. But sometimes, I still wonder if I'm ready to let go of the past." The Mafia boss nodded, his gaze turning toward the horizon. "Letting go doesn't mean forgetting," he said. "It means choosing not to let it control you anymore. It means making a decision, every day, to move forward." Maria looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "But what if I can't?" she asked. "What if I'm never truly free of it?" He paused, considering her words. The past was a powerful thing, something that clung to you, shaped you, no matter how hard you tried to move on. He knew that better than anyone. But he also knew that, despite the scars, you could find peace. "You don't have to be free of it," he said. "But you can choose not to let it define you. You can choose to live the life you want, not the life that's been forced on you." Maria took a deep breath, as if she was letting his words settle into her. For a moment, she said nothing, but the Mafia boss could see the change in her. The doubt in her eyes had lessened, replaced by a quiet resolve. "I think I'm ready," she said softly. "Ready to try." The Mafia boss gave her a small, reassuring smile. "That's all you can do," he said. "Just keep trying, every day, and I'll be here, every step of the way." They sat in silence after that, the only sound the gentle rush of water from the fountain. The Mafia boss knew the road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges that neither of them could anticipate. But he also knew that Maria was stronger than she thought. And maybe, just maybe, she would find the peace she had been searching for all along. Together, they would face whatever came next. The days passed, and a new rhythm began to settle into the mansion. For Maria, life had become a balancing act between the past and the present, between the scars that still lingered and the person she was becoming. The Mafia boss noticed the way she seemed to carry herself differently now, more confident, more grounded. But he also saw the moments when the weight of her past would pull her back, when the familiar ghosts would resurface. He could see it in her eyes, the way she would withdraw for a moment, a fleeting look of fear or doubt creeping across her face before she pushed it aside. It was a constant struggle for her, one he couldn't solve with a simple conversation or a gesture. Healing wasn't linear. But still, there was progress. Maria was beginning to embrace the idea that her past didn't have to define her, that she had the power to shape her future. She spent more time with the staff, chatting with them during meals, helping with small tasks, and even laughing. It wasn't the carefree laughter of someone who had never known pain, but the kind of laughter that comes from a place of understanding, someone who had seen the worst and was still fighting to find joy. The Mafia boss had kept his distance, still unsure of how to proceed. He had promised to help her, to protect her, but beyond that, he wasn't sure what role he was supposed to play in her life. Their bond had deepened over time, but he still wrestled with the feelings he had for her, feelings that went beyond mere responsibility. Every time he saw her smile, or every time their eyes met, he felt something stir inside him, a warmth, an ache, a longing. But he held back. He wasn't ready to confront those feelings. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the mansion grounds, the Mafia boss found himself walking through the hallways, his thoughts tangled. He had just come from a meeting with some of his associates, but his mind was on Maria. She had been quieter than usual that day, retreating into herself after a conversation with one of the other staff. It was small things like this that caught his attention now, every change in her demeanor, every shift in her mood. He found her sitting by the window in the library, her back turned to him, her fingers tracing the pages of a book she wasn't really reading. She had a habit of doing that, of pretending to be absorbed in something when her mind was elsewhere. The Mafia boss watched her for a moment before stepping into the room. "Maria," he said gently, his voice carrying in the quiet space. She looked up, startled at first, but then her expression softened. "I didn't hear you come in," she said, a slight smile on her lips. "I was just thinking." He nodded, stepping closer, his gaze focused on her. "About what?" he asked, his voice low, calm. Maria hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking down to the book in her hands before looking back at him. "I've been thinking about what comes next," she said slowly, her voice thoughtful. "I've been here for a while now, and I know I'm changing. But sometimes, I wonder if I'm really ready to step out into the world again, to make a life for myself outside of this place." The Mafia boss studied her carefully, his mind racing. He understood her hesitation. She had spent so long trapped in the shadows of her past, and now that she was beginning to step into the light, it must have felt overwhelming. "It's okay to be unsure," he said softly. "You don't have to have everything figured out right away. You've come so far, Maria, and that's enough for now." Maria looked down at her hands, her fingers still tracing the edges of the book. "But what if I'm not ready? What if I'm still too broken to start over?" she asked quietly. There was a vulnerability in her voice that the Mafia boss hadn't heard in a while. He stepped closer, sitting down beside her. "You're not broken," he said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "You've been through hell, but that doesn't make you broken. It makes you stronger than most people could ever understand. You've survived, and that in itself is a victory." Maria's eyes lifted to meet his, and for a moment, they just looked at each other in silence. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words, but there was an understanding there, a connection that neither of them could ignore. "I want to believe that," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "But sometimes it's hard to see beyond the past." The Mafia boss nodded. "I know, but the past doesn't have to define your future. It's a part of you. Yes, but it doesn't have to control you. You can choose who you become." Maria's gaze softened, and for the first time in a while, the tightness around her features seemed to ease. She let out a slow breath, as if releasing some of the tension she had been carrying. "I don't know where to start," she said. "I don't know how to let go of the fear." The Mafia boss gave a small, reassuring smile. "One step at a time," he said. "You don't have to do it all at once. Just take one step, and then another. And when you fall, I'll be there to help you get back up." Maria looked at him, her expression filled with gratitude, but also uncertainty. She had come so far, but there were still so many unanswered questions. "Thank you," she whispered. The Mafia boss didn't say anything, but the warmth in his eyes conveyed more than words ever could. He didn't know what the future held, for her or for them, but he knew one thing: they would face it together. As the sun dipped lower and the room filled with the soft glow of twilight, they sat there in silence, two people who had come a long way from where they once were, but still uncertain about the road ahead. And for the first time in a long time, the Mafia boss didn't feel the need to have all the answers. He only knew that, whatever came next, they would face it side by side. As the weeks turned into months, the mansion that had once felt so cold and imposing became a place of quiet transformation. Maria had found her place in the world again. Slowly, but steadily, she had begun to rebuild her life, piece by piece. The scars of her past were still there, hidden beneath the surface, but they no longer dictated who she was or who she could become. The Mafia boss, though still distant in many ways, had witnessed her growth, and it had stirred something within him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He had never been a man for vulnerability, always preferring to keep his emotions locked away. But with Maria, things were different. She had shown him a side of life he had long since forgotten. It wasn't about power or control, but about connection, about caring for someone without expecting anything in return. And for the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand the depth of that. The bond between them had become something unspoken but undeniable. They didn't need to say it out loud. There were moments, like the one they shared by the fountain, where their eyes would meet, and everything else would fade away. The weight of their shared silence spoke volumes. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, painting the mansion with golden light, the Mafia boss found himself walking through the garden. His thoughts were once again preoccupied with Maria, but this time, he wasn't so uncertain about where they stood. He had come to accept that whatever feelings he had for her, whatever connection they shared, was something he was willing to explore, even if it was new and uncomfortable. He had been through so much in his life, and Maria, in her own quiet way, had helped him face parts of himself he had long buried. She had given him a glimpse of what it meant to live without fear, without constantly watching his back. As he approached the garden, he saw her standing by the fountain, her back to him, her eyes focused on the water. She was no longer the broken girl who had stumbled into the mansion all those months ago. She was stronger now, more at peace with herself, and the sight of her standing there, in the golden light, filled him with a sense of pride. He walked up beside her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The silence between them was comforting, familiar. Finally, Maria spoke, her voice quiet but filled with a sense of resolve. "I've been thinking," she began, "about the future, about what comes next." The Mafia boss nodded, his eyes fixed on her. "And what does the future look like?" he asked, his voice calm, curious. Maria turned to face him, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I think I'm ready," she said softly. "Ready to take control of my life, to leave the past behind, and to start living on my own terms." The Mafia boss felt a strange sense of warmth at her words, a sense of fulfillment. He had watched her struggle, had seen the pain and the doubt in her eyes, but now, she was standing tall. She had found her own strength, and that, more than anything, made him proud. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "I'm proud of you." Maria's smile deepened, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. The Mafia boss's heart skipped a beat at her words, and for a brief moment, he was at a loss for how to respond. He had never been good with words, especially when it came to matters of the heart. But in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. The connection they shared wasn't just a product of circumstance or duty. It was real, and it was something he wasn't willing to lose. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, a simple gesture, but one that felt like an unspoken promise. "You'll never have to face it alone," he said softly. "I'm here, always." Maria's eyes met his, and in that moment, there was an understanding between them, something deeper than words could express. The world outside the mansion was full of uncertainty, full of things they couldn't control, but together, they had found something that could weather any storm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." The Mafia boss gave her a small, reassuring smile, his thumb gently brushing over the back of her hand. "You've earned it," he said, his voice steady but filled with a warmth that was new to him. They stood there for a long while, the silence between them now comfortable, no longer heavy with unspoken fears or doubts. As the sun set behind them, casting the garden in shades of purple and orange, the Mafia boss realized that, for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. Not of his past, not of the future. The only thing that mattered was the present, and in this moment, with Maria by his side, everything felt right. It wasn't perfect, and they still had a long way to go. But for the first time, He was willing to face whatever came next with open eyes, knowing that he wouldn't have to face it alone. Together, they would walk forward, not as master and servant, not as protector and the one protected, but as two people who had found something worth holding on to. And that was enough. In this captivating tale of dark romance, a powerful mafia boss and a troubled young woman find themselves caught in a whirlwind of emotions, pain, and healing. As they navigate the complexity of their bond, their journey is fraught with the haunting shadows of their pasts. This dark romance explores themes of growth, redemption, and the quiet strength that comes from embracing vulnerability. The mafia boss, a man of control and power, finds his world turned upside down as he becomes entangled with a woman who has suffered in silence for far too long. Their connection deepens as Maria begins to shed the scars of her past, learning to trust again and reclaim her life, step by step. But the road to healing is not without its struggles, as both characters are forced to confront their inner demons. With moments of tenderness and raw emotion, this dark romance takes readers on an emotional roller coaster, revealing that even in the darkest of places, love can still blossom. Will the mafia boss be able to protect Maria from the lingering shadows of her past, or will their shared darkness pull them under? This story of resilience, trust, and the healing power of love captures the essence of dark romance in a way that will leave you breathless, reminding you that sometimes the deepest love is born from the most unexpected places.